So, we want to talk a little bit about Hostess. I want to bring in a guest. We got Mark Mix with us, and he's with the National Right to Work Foundation, Defense Foundation, and I want to talk a little bit about Hostess, Mark, and I also want to talk about the role of private sector unions in general. But let's start with Hostess. Is this simply a case of burdensome union contracts has driven Hostess out of business, or has it also been a changing business climate? What's going on with Hostess?
Well, I think this is kind of a perfect storm for them, unfortunately. It is a sad day for the 18,000 workers who are going to lose their jobs. The fact is, during the 5-year reorganization from 2000 to 2009, the company tried to set a course that was going to get them on a proper financial footing. They got lots of private equity money. They got some other investment firms to jump in. And Dick Gephardt, actually, this is a name from the past, Dick Gephardt and his lobbying operation handled this negotiation back in 2004 to 2009 with the Ripplewood Group that provided the first boost of money. Gephardt was very, very close to the Teamsters. The Teamsters agreed to concessions back then. It actually cost some Teamsters some jobs, but they left in place some of the work rules that now are burdening this company. For example, Ho-Hos and Wonder Bread cannot be delivered on the same truck. 2 trucks have to go to the supermarket, one to deliver the Ho-Hos and the Twinkies, and one to deliver Wonder Bread. That can't work in a marketplace where competition's increasing, costs are increasing, and efficiency is being demanded.
So now you're hitting on a larger theme, which I wanted to move to. So let's talk about private sector unions in general for a moment. I want to put up a chart for our viewers. I want to show you private sector union membership over the past 80 years or so. That dates back to 1929. What you can see is in the 1930s and 40s, right after World War II, union membership, private sector union membership, was at its all-time high. It approached 40% of total employment. But look where we are now. We're down below 7% union membership in the private sector. That's lower than when the Wagner Act was passed in 1930, which required, it first of all gave employees the right to unionize and required employers to negotiate with unions. Mark, why are we seeing such a decline in union membership across all businesses?
Well, Will, I think the reason is pointed out in your introduction there. The fact is that unions now rely on government for their power. And the fact is they're not providing services to workers anymore. They're trying very hard, but it's very difficult when you spend half your time and half your money playing in politics because you're trying to protect your privilege. Workers in America are getting paychecks, they're getting benefits, they're getting a relationship with their employer that basically is important to each, because if they don't work, then nobody makes any money. And if an employer treats an employee poorly, then they're not going to make any money either. So this idea of confrontation in labor policy is something that's antiquated. It did come out of the 1930s. Those were the halcyon days for unions, but now they actually have to sell a product to workers they're not very good at.
Yeah, it's competition. So you guys buck. I saw a statistic where union members make on average, I think, 19% more than non-union private sector employees. But that essentially, that benefit of making more money by being a union member was something that existed in the 70s and prior, as competition has found itself into the marketplace. Whether or not you're talking about competing with Little Debbie's or whatever it may be, it's basically made every business have much stricter employment arrangements and taken away the ability for employees to negotiate for much higher things through union membership.
We also saw this in the GM restructuring. I mean, they actually made sure that even though it went through a sort of bankruptcy with, of course, a lot of government giveaways to them, and decided that the bondholders no longer, their contracts were null and void, they made sure that, for example, when they rehire people back, they have to hire people that lost their jobs as part of that initial restructuring. So you have to hire them back at their initial wage. So what you see is the unions continuing to try to sort of hold on to the glory of the past, which I think is what you're referring to here. But I also see this, and Matt, this is where I was immediately thinking about you, because this is just a little too late for us, unfortunately, after the election, because what we see here is the reality of what it means to have a company where they don't restructure properly. You see that, for example, a union can just crater it. These people who are standing out there saying, we're not going back in, we're done. Mitt Romney, vulture capitalism, all of that stuff. The private equity firm that actually was involved in this wasn't successful. They're not going to make out on this at all. They were trying to prevent 18,000 people from losing their jobs and everybody winning out. Maybe some people would have lost their jobs. But the story that we were told about private equity in cases like this is that it's never the union's fault. It's guys like Mitt Romney who come in and just destroy everything. Well, those 18,000 people lost their jobs because somebody like Mitt Romney wasn't able to turn it around.
Yeah, in this situation, it was either all or nothing. thing. Either the union got their way and got their demands met, or they're out of work. There's no middle ground. You don't really call it a negotiation. There was no negotiation.
There's a phrase for it. It's called cutting off your nose to spite your face.
So what happened, Guy, that's the theory in private sector unions, that you won't get into these situations because ultimately bankruptcy and going out of business will cause the private sector union to make concessions as opposed to a public sector union. What happened here?
Well, you actually are seeing two private sector unions going at each other now, with the Teamsters throwing the bakers overboard, saying, we actually negotiated a deal, we were willing to make concessions, and then at the 11th hour the bakers said, nope, not good enough for us, and then everyone lost their job. And so there's infighting within the private sector unions, which I think the chart that we saw, that number could keep dipping lower if this sort of thing continues to happen.
Hey, Mark, let me bring you back. Is the concept of union membership, is it even a thing of the past? I suggested that many are saying the benefits that unions could bring to their employees existed in a world which was essentially a low competition world. You only had a few players in the steel industry or the auto industry. When there's only 2 or 3 guys competing, the profit margins allowed you to give big benefits to employees that unions demanded. But in a highly competitive world, that's no longer possible.
Well, it's certainly more difficult, but there is a place for unions in America. When an employer steps on employees and does things wrong, then the employees need a voice and they need to be able to join together voluntarily. And that's the key word. Going back to the internal union dispute here, it's interesting, one of the really surprising anecdotes of this whole fight is the Teamsters are asking the Bakers Union officials to have a secret ballot as to whether or not the Bakers members want to accept these concessions. They say you can't have a voice vote in the union hall because there's too much pressure. They want a secret ballot, but yet the Teamsters have been pushing for card check unionization of workers across the marketplace, and President Obama and Richard Trump are now talking about card check again. That's a really interesting point. I'm glad you brought that up about the Teamsters and the Bakers.
So, Mark, this is Amy here. You added an interesting detail that I think probably surprised a lot of our viewers, that this labor contract between the Bakers and Hostess involved things like having multiple trucks, that you couldn't put 2 different products.
One red hose couldn't be on the same truck.
No contamination.
Right. It seems just insane and inane. But clearly it's to be able to have more truck drivers and more workers and increase the staff. Are we going to see contracts like this change that is really going to be strictly focused on those labor issues you mentioned? For example, an employer being abusive to employees and being able to protect employees, not dictate to a company how they have their supply delivery chain?
I think that's going to be a result of all this. As the economy begins to struggle along, and whether you believe it's coming out or going in doesn't really matter at this point, but the competitive marketplace is much different than it was. And certainly this type of zero-sum game, this confrontational politics that has been practiced for years and years and years, is now showing itself to be severely wanting, particularly when you talk about a company that's got 40 different pension plans, these multiple employee pension plans that require all employers to pay in, no employee contributions. And then as a company goes bankrupt or moves out of business, all the other companies have to make up for the loss there of the pension money. And that's what Hostess is faced with here. They've got 40 different pension programs. They've got 372 different contracts. They've got dozens of different unions. It's really hard to compete with in that environment.
Right. Well, Mark, we're going to have to let you go. In addition to the 40 pension programs and liabilities they also have a ton of brands. And so many are saying that these brands could be auctioned off. The brands may continue to exist. Even companies like Bimbo, which is a Mexican company, are talking about possibly coming in. But anyways, thanks, Mark. GOP lawmakers are continuing the long process of post-election soul searching. The latest item under review.